This week for warning signs, we are dealing less with a quiet issue that has bubbled up and more with like a very big, very loud, important issue that has again bubbled up to maybe some more importance than we all might have expected at this time in our fall. For our guests, we are welcoming Heather Williams, who is the director on the project on nuclear issues at CSIS. No surprise, since given her title and given my hinting, we're going to talk nuclear weapons this week. To set the stage, this is not a topic I necessarily wanted to become prominent, but here we are. A few weeks ago, President Trump announced that he wanted to restart nuclear weapons testing, which, to be fair, surprised a lot of people. Pretty bold. We haven't tested nuclear weapons since 1992, and we'll get into a little bit about why. But then almost immediately, kind of embarrassingly, the Secretary of Energy basically said, oh, no, not actually happening. He said, actually, we're not doing that right now, which is interesting because usually when an administration makes a major policy announcement, particularly the president, the cabinet doesn't say like, oh, wait, never mind, particularly on social media. But this is the world we're in right now. Augmenting that, we've had a lot of nuclear thoughts in the background because of a recent movie that came out, House of Dynamite. This all kind of adds up to none of us quite wanted this to be a topic that we are having to focus on too much. Fortunately, Heather does that for us professionally, but wanted to bring to light some of the issues this raises in terms of nuclear governance and accountability, how modern nuclear competition works out, and also clearly how we feel about the movie. So we first wanted to start with the most literal question. What actually happened here? Was Trump just like floating an idea and got shut down? Is this something that seems to be an actual real plan behind the scenes? Does the moment actually call for nuclear weapons testing the way we haven't done before? And is this administration trying to signal like what's up with how it thinks about deterrence?
So what does this moment mean and what's actually going on? What was it meant to signal? I'm going to be honest, I don't know because the
That's a
president
perfectly
hasn't
fine
clarified.
answer.
Yeah, I want to
But
be
also
totally
terrifying still.
transparent. I can't read the president's mind, and particularly on this post that he put out on his social media platform. So not always the best way to clarify a nuanced nuclear policy issue, but we are where we are. The Russians have also made a point. They've made this point a few times in the past week that they have been asking Trump for clarification or asking the administration for clarification on what he meant. They also are not getting answers. So it's still pretty murky what exactly the president meant by this announcement. But I can try to break it down like this. I think the president could have meant one of four things. I'm not sure that the president knows about the nuance across these four things, but here are the implications. It could be one of four things. The first would be a return to explosive weapons testing. So either underground tests, I don't think above ground tests are on the cards. We're not going to see any mushroom clouds going off, but it could be a return to explosive testing. North Korea is the only country that has been doing that in recent years, but that is one option. The second option would be what's called supercritical testing, where it is a nuclear experiment that produces a self-sustaining chain reaction, which means that it has a yield. It's not going to show up on seismic monitors. We might never know that it happened, but you can do this to test the plutonium, test weapons designs, things like that. Option number 3 would be subcritical testing, which is nuclear experiments that don't produce a yield. And the last thing is he might not have been talking about nuclear warheads at all. He might have just been talking about delivery vehicles because he recently announced that they had tested an underwater drone. They had tested the Burevestnik. And so it could have just been, a semantics issue that has led to all of this kerfuffle and excitement about what exactly the president meant. But I think we can rule out explosives testing. Folks from the administration have come out and said he didn't mean delivery vehicles. So that leaves us with buckets 2 or 3. I wouldn't rule anything out because, again, he hasn't clarified. But just one point I really want to stress on the supercritical testing side is that State Department compliance reports for the past few years across administrations have suggested that Russia and China might be conducting this type of supercritical testing, which is nuclear experiments that produce a self-sustaining chain reaction. And based on our interpretation of the nuclear test ban treaty, that means that they would be cheating, which is why it's come up in these compliance reports. And so, because of the way that Trump's post framed the issue, it made it sound like, well, Russia and China are doing this thing. We have to do this thing too. And that's why that's kind of where my money is on what he might have meant. He might have gotten some briefing saying, we think Russia and China might be in violation of some of these agreements. And that could be what prompted his post. But again, I'm not going to try to read the man's mind on this one.
I have so many questions. I will try to combine two into one, and then we'll drill down of like wherever excites us the most. So the first is the why, that kind of like the why should our listeners care? Because like unlike people on the screen right now, probably not a lot of people who are listening spend a lot of their time thinking about nuclear weapons policy and are not necessarily immediately grappling with why was it a big deal for the president to say he was going to do this and to have it walked back. But then as it relates to that, I'd love to offer just a little bit of context in the background of like, why did we stop testing, at least in some of the contexts you're talking about, why did we stop testing in the first place? So let's start there. And there's lots of deep holes that we can get after that.
Yeah, so in terms of why we stopped testing, so as you said, we stopped testing in 92. There were a host of reasons. The first one being we conducted over 1,000 explosive nuclear tests by that point, and we'd gotten a lot of data. We had gotten a lot of all the data that we thought was necessary to assure that our nuclear arsenal was credible. And so that's the primary reason. If we ever do return to testing, it would probably be for technical reasons. Things like, plutonium ages. We don't totally understand how plutonium will age. And so conducting tests might help us understand that better in the future. But in 92, it was decided, do you know what? We have enough test data. The other reason is just to really stress, nuclear testing caused some pretty horrific environmental and humanitarian consequences. The downwinders in Nevada, Utah, Colorado, who live downwind, as the name suggests, from the nuclear test sites, were really active in pushing for a testing moratorium. But then also, this was like the end of the Cold War, this like flurry of arms control activity and disarmament efforts that were going on. And so the political context in which we stopped also really matters. It's worth noting Russia and China also stopped explosive testing around the same time, but they had both done a lot fewer tests than we had. Russia had done a couple hundred fewer. China had done less than 100 tests, explosive tests. So if we did return, and this gets to your first question, why would this be a big deal? The number one reason I think this would be a big deal is because if the U.S. returns to explosive testing, other countries will follow. It won't be like, oh, we're just going to do one. No, it would be this cascade of other countries that start testing. And the country that will benefit the most from a return to nuclear testing is China. They don't have as much test data by orders of magnitude. If they want to try out new weapons designs, they stopped producing fissile material a while ago. If they want to test out how their plutonium is behaving, there's a host of reasons why China would probably love to return to nuclear testing to get that data. So that's the reason I think we should care about nuclear testing. In terms of why to care about nuclear weapons, I think that people this is where I always say, like, those of us who work on nuclear weapons, we literally live in a nuclear silo. And it's so obvious to us. Like, of course, these things are really important. Of course, everybody. Yes, they are a big deal. That's what we all try to tell ourselves sometimes. But for the rest of the world, they kind of left the public consciousness. You don't see them on the news every day. You don't see them being used in war, thank goodness. But we do still live with tens of thousands of these weapons that have just unprecedented destructive power, and they're still in the hands of 9 countries. The final reason I would say why people should care is that there has been a very carefully crafted system trying to manage all of those thousands and thousands of weapons to prevent them from proliferating, to prevent them from being used. And that system is crumbling. The guardrails are falling off. And so nuclear weapons might not have been part of the public consciousness for quite a while, they are becoming part of the public consciousness again for the wrong reasons.
Or maybe, so maybe I'll ask this in a slightly controversial way, sort of in two parts, but maybe then it's valuable to have this notion of nuclear risk, this concept of nuclear weapons and what they are returned to the public side, to public consciousness. But the flip side is, that is obviously much less controlled in what the public thinks about. So how do we think about, and maybe for our listeners to better understand, what are the less explosive institutional mechanisms that allow verification and validation of our stockpile, and what are the trade-offs there in terms of effectiveness and understanding, our stockpile quality and our weapons quality, but also in the public consciousness side.
Also, is it just like so tempting for people who work on nuclear weapons issues every day to just use all kinds of puns and analogies all the time? Because I would not be able to stop myself.
Me too. It'd be hard to be taken seriously.
Yeah.
I am not good at puns, but I appreciate a good pun. And so I saw what you did there, Rada, and I greatly enjoyed it. But yeah, I worked in a silo pun, and we're just over 10 minutes into the conversation. So I'll take that as a win. But in terms of, Rada, to your first point, I actually think it's a really good thing that nuclear weapons are coming back into the public discussion, because they are still all out there. I think it's hard to have a public discussion about them with the necessary nuance, though, because it really quickly turns into, oh, these things are really, really bad and we have to get rid of them, or we should be using them for nuclear war fighting. And, those are two very extreme positions. And there's a lot of space and a lot of challenging policy questions in between there. Should you elevate nuclear risk if it means preventing the likelihood of nuclear use? That's the eternal kind of moral paradox and security paradox around nuclear weapons. But I'm sure we'll talk about the movie in a little bit, but that's perhaps my biggest plus from House of Dynamite, is it has people thinking about nuclear issues again. But to the question about why about testing and how are we confirming, the credibility of the arsenal? So we do these nuclear experiments, the subcritical testing that has allowed the national labs to validate every year that the nuclear arsenal is safe, secure, and reliable without a return to explosive testing. And the lab directors have done that every single year. They have done it under Republican and Democrat administrations. Political leaders, such as the administrator of the National Nuclear Security Administration, have consistently said we don't need to return to nuclear testing. And so you have the political and scientific leadership coming out and saying we don't need to return to explosive weapons testing. With that said, I've written a lot over the past few weeks about Trump's comments, and a few folks from the technical community have reached out to me and said, well, actually, it might be nice to get more test data, particularly about how things age. Do the parts still work the way that they're meant to? Some of them will even admit, I'm a scientist. I want to actually test my theory. But it's like nobody that I have talked to is like, desperate to see a return to explosive weapons testing or any sort of underground testing like that. We aren't in that space. And so that's why I'm leaning towards thinking that the president meant supercritical testing. But again, it's really hard to know.
All right. So you mentioned the movie House of Dynamite. It came out a few weeks ago, and it generated just like a lot of takes by people who work very much in your field, takes up by people on the outside. I think my primary takeaway, this is slightly spoiling, but not fully spoiling the movie, is like, I actually don't know how one would get to the roof of the Pentagon. Like, I think that this is actually would be a challenge to actually.
Oh, I know.
You do? You can do it?
Because I had no idea. In that brief period, I had my time out, and I was at DA, Director of Administration and Management. Yeah.
You can get to the
headquarters. You can get to the roof. And we do. There's a variety of security, but also there's solar panels. There's a lot of good stuff up there.
Who knew? Okay. Well, okay. But seriously, back on the House of Dynamite movie without spoiling the ending. We could probably spend a lot of time talking through this, but if you could suggest, like you said that like this is actually valuable, the movie and other things, this is actually valuable for people to start thinking about these issues in a different way, because there are lots of things crumbling around the margins here. Are there actual one or two takeaways from the movie for the people who are not drowning in nuclear weapons every day? Like, what would you want them to have taken away from the I guess it was 3 different stories of the same story that came out from the movie?
My number one takeaway would be just remember that this is a movie. It was intentionally dramatized.
Uh-huh.
The time compression is the part that most people who work on nuclear weapons that I talk to, that most of us take issue with, which is the notion that you have to decide that fast. Is just simply, not very realistic. And there have been a couple nuclear issues in pop culture lately that all suggest there's going to be this bolt out of the blue, and I don't know. That just seems like the least likely scenario. That is not the thing about nuclear weapons that would keep me up at night by any means. And so, the first thing would be it's a movie. A quick sub bullet to that, because this was the biggest issue that I did have with the movie, the biggest problem I had with it, it was the representation of the military. It portrays U.S. Strategic Command and the STRATCOM commander as this like warmongering, Dunkin' Donuts drinking, very aggressive, controlling military guy who's trying to like pressure the president into using a nuclear weapon.
Now, the Dunkin' Donuts drinking, slightly more plausible, but the rest of it,
yeah.
less so.
Well,
That's the point.
I was going to say, like, I know that there's a lot of caffeine consumed out in Omaha. I'm not gonna judge that at all. But from the folks that I've known at US Stratcom, that's like the opposite. They are the most thoughtful, careful, kind of not reticent, because they're very much about the credibility of the deterrent, obviously. But they really think through these things and wouldn't be the first, I think, to jump to some of the conclusions that we saw in that movie. So I think that that's my first one. Just remember, this is a movie. A lot of it is dramatized. This is not a documentary. I wish that could have been like a bumper sticker throughout the whole movie. This is not a documentary. I think the second takeaway that I would have, it's more a question that I hope it prompts for people, which is our nuclear, actually, let me rephrase that, is our strategic arsenal fit for purpose? Should we have more ground-based intercepts? Should we have a better sensing network that might have picked up where this was coming from? Should we have more nuclear options to give to the president? Should we have more conventional options to give to the president? I just hope people don't walk out of this and be like, the only answer is nuclear disarmament. No, the answer should be, do we have the tools in the toolkit to deal with threats like what this movie portrays? And obviously I have my own views on that and where I think we need to make investments. But, I saw the movie with my colleague who's the director of the Missile Defense Program, and we walked out of it and he's like, what did you think? And I was like, I think we need more ground-based intercepts. And he was like, okay, that's not necessarily the right answer. I'm like, no, but why did they only have 2? Why not launch more? I understand you have to keep them in reserve, but we should have more so that we don't have to hold back. And he was like, yeah, I don't think that's going to be everybody's takeaway from this movie. But I genuinely hope that people walk out of it being like, oh, yeah, we still have the strategic arsenal and all of these capabilities. Are they fit for purpose? And have we invested enough in them? But I actually have a question for you two, because I think some of the most interesting parts of the movie were the portrayal of the White House, of the Pentagon. I mean, was that realistic based on your experiences?
I mean, I think like just pulling the movie, but also many other movies that are portraying this relationship. One thing to your point around like it's all a movie is to remember that White Houses and Pentagons are made up of people who are just humans who have relationships, and they have drama and they have beefs and they have shorthand, and some of them communicate really, really well under pressure, and some of them absolutely do not. And it's actually quite hard to control for that dynamic when you're slotting people into roles. And I vividly remember this is not a scenario anywhere close to the level of us we were talking about, but I remember being in a meeting where it was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Secretary of Defense, the president, and several others were talking. And one of them was using high risk in a very different way than other people around the table were using high risk. But they all thought they were using it in the same way, and therefore were making a decision to do something about a thing. And I walked away having this moment of panic, being like, how can we level set on just like vocabulary here, guys? Because I feel like you all you're together all the time. How do you not know how each other talks? But it's pretty common to end up in a room where you're just making so many assumptions about what everyone else is imagining and thinking is available to you. And also that you believe that everyone else has the same amount of information that you do, which is just generally not true. Like, people have not always read their paper. They don't know everything that somebody else may have available in terms of toolkits. They don't necessarily know the context or other things, which is why we have an NSC, but there's a vastly imperfect mechanism if you don't have some of those common underlying things. Rada, what about you? Because you've seen so many versions of this too.
Yes, I was like, so I haven't seen this specific movie, but I have seen many versions of the Pentagon portrayal in the movies. And my biggest takeaway is like not dissimilar to Lawrence, which is people forget that the Pentagon is a truly enormous enterprise. So I know we think of it as like this warfighting machine, and there is this very, especially in the nuclear weapons context, but in general, there is this very specific chain of command on that warfighting side. But like, most of what the Pentagon and the military establishment is oriented around is actually managing that enormous, like almost $1 trillion, 3 million person organization. And so much of the nuclear weapons program and so much of these large programs or anything is that. And that means like lawyers and finance people and figuring out how you get memos. So to Lauren's point, everyone has the right thing, right, same information, and then figuring out that like this person over there has some information that that guy over there needs, but they, were in the same intern class and have hated each other for 25 years, so haven't talked. It's just like, it's like any large enterprise, and that is so mundane, even though the topic is so like important that it's hard to hold both in your head. And I think almost no movies, Space Force, that show got some of the like mundane ridiculousness of the mundane out there. And I feel like that's what you need, like a West Wing Veep crossover, but the Pentagon edition.
The last thing I'll mention on this is like, there are some elements of this kind of decision making that are highly professionalized and very well run. And you all, people, listeners who are not familiar with this, would be very happy with the fact, like, okay, we put a lot of time and energy into this. There are other things, I'll try to generalize here. I just remember us doing an exercise one time where everyone was supposed to be referencing the same thing and everyone should have had access to this one thing. And most of them were like, what? Where is that? I kind of can't remember how to get it in my face. How do I do that? And like, oh God. All right. I'm just going to like take a deep breath and have another cup of coffee and it's all going to be fine. Heather, I have one last question for you before we have to go. So we've talked about like what you would like people to have taken away from the movie. And we've talked about how and why testing, or what do we think that this whole testing comment meant? What should we actually be paying attention to in terms of the nuclear weapons enterprise and the overall nuclear deterrent? Is there a signal, a metric, like a thing that you're like, actually, all the attention was over here because he tweeted, but we should really be focusing on these other things because they are falling apart in some way?
So this is a nuclear issue. It's not about the enterprise. It's something that was in Trump's tweet, but that people just, or not tweet, whatever he posted, whatever the post was. It was in his message, but just hasn't got that much attention. What I think everybody on the whole planet should be paying more attention to is the expansion of Russia and China's nuclear arsenals.
Yeah.
They are in my view, they are getting off scot-free in the international community. They are not being held accountable for the quantitative expansion of their arsenals. Like China's arsenal is growing by 20% a year. They are projected to have 1,000 warheads by 2030. At a certain point, they're going to run into a fissile material problem. But nonetheless, like, they're expanding so fast. They are not being transparent about it. Russia is not being transparent about what they are doing. And, that if you remember a few years ago, that whole worry about, is Russia going to put a nuclear weapon in space? That's still a concern. Like, that is not something that they have taken off the table. And so, I think it's important that we have these conversations about what is nuclear testing. Should the U.S. return to nuclear testing? But let's not lose sight of why the president made that comment. He made the comment because Russia and China are being really aggressive with their nuclear programs, and nobody's keeping them in check. So, I have like some concerns about, are we implementing our modernization plan fast enough? How could we leverage it better? Do we need a more flexible force? Yes, we do. But it's really the driver behind this, which is Moscow and Beijing. And I really hope that this conversation about testing, but also the movie, kind of highlights there are bad actors out there.
Mhm.
I think what Russia and China are doing is pretty aggressive, dangerous behavior. And we really have to find a way to hold them accountable and to bring them to the table to try to reduce the risks of this getting out of hand.
It is a great closing takeaway, and another reminder that at the end of the day, a lot of this is just about relationships, about capabilities that are
That's
associated
right.
with that, but relationships are the key driver in the conversation. Heather, thank you so much for joining us. This was well, it was both delightful and terrifying, which is a great
Yeah.
mix of the podcast.
I
I'm
have that
sure.
effect on people.
It's a great kind of thing to have on your resume. I am delightful and terrifying.
Yeah.
We folks who are listening to the longer mini episode, please go back and leave us a review. We would be delighted to have you, and also check out Heather's work at csis.org.